Okay. Well, with that, it is noon on the dot here, Thursday, May 21st, 2026. So, want to give folks just a little bit of time to filter in. I know there's a lot going on this week with an energy conference and certainly a lot of travel involved. So, really appreciative to folks peeling away for an hour this afternoon to discuss the concept of unified economic dispatch and its potential fit here in Alaska's Railbelt region. I'm Donovan Rusaniello. I'm the outreach director for REAP. I'll introduce our other speakers here momentarily, but just wanted to begin with the land acknowledgement and always ground us in the fact that, I'm zooming in here from Dena'ina Elnena in Anchorage, from the unceded territories of Alaska Native peoples. And certainly here at REAP, we draw immense inspiration from their generations of stewardship of these lands and waters, and just their real approach to efficiently using the resources available to us and living within our means. And so as an organization that's committed to driving the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency in the state of Alaska, that's certainly a model that we want to follow. So wanted to ground us in that before we dive in. Also just wanted to encourage folks who are in attendance here to introduce themselves in the chat, maybe with your name and affiliation and where you're zooming in from today. And as I said, wanted to introduce our organization as well for those who aren't familiar or always appreciate it. Renewable Energy Alaska Project is a statewide nonprofit with 14 staff who adhere to that mission through education, workforce development, training, community engagement, and policy research, drafting, and advocacy. But we also represent a coalition of over 60 dues-paying member organizations that really run the gamut from Alaska Native organizations to private developers, electric utilities, other nonprofits, educational institutions, and local governments who all really want to see progress made on that mission of developing renewables and energy efficiency in Alaska, and we partnered together to make that happen. So really appreciative to have a representative of one of our REAP members on the panel this afternoon. I guess maybe just before diving into the discussion, we certainly want to leave time for Q&A at the end. So I wanted to remind folks that the Q&A function provided by the Zoom webinar here is a great way to just sort of like log questions for our panelists so that we make sure and distinguish that from the chat, and then make sure that we have some time at the end to address those. Just answering a few other sort of like common questions. This will be recorded and posted to the REAP YouTube channel and website afterwards. And we'll certainly share contact information for Anthony and Julie afterwards as well, so that we can really sort of just use this as a launching off point for a discussion around this concept and its potential fit for the Railbelt, and ways that we could work together to hopefully secure it and establish it here in our region. But without further ado, I do want to just introduce our speakers, and just, my role is to facilitate the conversation with these experts. And so before doing so, I want to at least introduce who we have on the panel today. First off is Julie Esty, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Matanuska Electric Association, which is Alaska's oldest existing and second largest electric cooperative, serving over, I think, 57,000 member owners in South Central Alaska and the Railbelt here. In her role, Julie oversees the development and execution of MEA's long-term strategic initiatives, and also leads external efforts regarding legislation, partnerships with stakeholders, and collaboration with other Railbelt utilities. I think she's been at MEA for more than 12 years now, most recently as the Senior Director of External Affairs and Strategic Initiatives. But she also has a really interesting and long sort of like winding career, which touches on dog mushing as the former Executive Director of the Yukon Quest, and then also, consulting in Chicago, and then also that shift back into energy in a role at the Alaska Center of Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So really appreciate that broad expertise and certainly representation from the second largest electric cooperative in the state to talk about the benefits of unified economic dispatch in the Railbelt. And then, of course, our other panelist this afternoon is Anthony Scott, who's the Director of Economic and Regulatory Analysis here at REAP. He came to Alaska in 2000 after receiving his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a focus on natural resource economics. And he's been conducting economic and policy analysis of Alaska energy issues ever since. So he's worked in government as staff economist at the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, also as commercial analyst and petroleum investment manager at the Division of Oil and Gas and the Department of Natural Resources. He's also commissioner at the RCA. He spent several years at ASEP and was the director of policy and programs at the former Anchorage Municipal Light and Power electric utility. So a lot of, that's a mouthful because these folks are so expert in what they do and bring a wealth of knowledge regarding energy issues. So really appreciative to these two for joining us today. I wanted to just sort of kick us off and with an initial goal of just agreeing to a common definition for unified economic dispatch for the purposes of today's discussion. And I know, Anthony, you really have a great way of sort of breaking down each of the sort of like sub concepts. So I wanted to hand it off to you to just start with perhaps economic dispatch as a concept and its relevance to the rail belt, and then step us through all the way up to unified economic dispatch, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So economic dispatch is something that each of our railbelt utilities already do today and have done for a very long time. And that is to reliably operate the generation and transmission assets that they have, and now battery assets that they have, to deliver power to their customers on an instantaneous basis. So it's basically just to operate the stuff that you have efficiently. When we say economic dispatch, what we really mean is security constrained economic dispatch. We often drop the security constrained part, but we always mean it. And the security constraint is living within the reliability standards that we have. And for a long time in the rail belt, we only had voluntary reliability standards, and increasingly now we have mandatory reliability standards, and those impose obligations to operate your stuff in a way that you'll still be able to reliably deliver power if things are slightly different or significantly different than you expect. And that's what the reliability standards are meant to do. Unified economic dispatch involves trying to do that within the rail belt as a whole, ignoring the ownership differences between or across generation and transmission assets. So rather than Golden Valley trying to do economic dispatch only within its own service territory, unified economic dispatch would lump all of Golden Valley's assets, generation and transmission, with all of the other railbelt utilities assets and their demand. And that total system would be operated effectively as one without regard to who owns what. So that's basically, I think, what we mean by unified economic dispatch. And I encourage Julie to correct me or add color where she thinks it's important.
Yeah, I don't have any corrections. I think you outlined it well. This is something that the utilities are doing day by day for their own members right now. And I think, we use words like efficiency and reliability, and just to add a little color around there, I mean, when we say efficiency, we're looking at the lowest cost, really. Like, how can we get the kilowatt hour for the lowest amount of resource? So right now, that sometimes is water, sometimes that is gas, diesel. And so we're really looking at how do we get that kilowatt hour for the lowest resource, and that resource is a cost. And so it really comes down to that lowest cost resource. And then adding the reliability, that's making sure that not only that we're keeping the lights on, but the power quality is there and that we can count on it into the future. So just breaking down some of those words that we use just, all the time. But I think when we talk about efficiency, it really comes down to that cost. And for utilities, that's passed directly through to members. So it's really the single biggest thing that we can do to connect what we're doing operationally into the service and the cost that you see as a member.
Great, thank you. And I guess, so certainly, or Anthony, did you want to jump in? I saw you.
Okay.
Feel free to. So maybe contextually, I really appreciate you mentioning that, within their separate service territories, the utilities are trying to do this on a daily basis. And when we talk about unified economic dispatch, it's sort of that rail belt wide, system wide security constrained economic dispatch. Before diving more into the rail belt, just contextually speaking, this is a concept, right, that is adhered to. It's been established many other places in the United States, I believe. So maybe if either of you could share just sort of like that context on, you know, the concept and how it's been adhered to elsewhere in our country.
Sure. I mean, there are a number of regions which do unified security constrained economic dispatch within the region across multiple separate utilities. And usually the dispatch is handled, in fact, always the dispatch is handled by a nonprofit, fully independent entity called an independent system operator or a regional transmission operator. They're the same thing. But you know, in California, there are many utilities that participate in CAISO, and in the upper Midwest, there are multiple utilities that participate in MISO, SPP, PJM. They do this in Alberta and ACO. So yeah, so it's not a new idea and it's not unusual practice. So it's possible. We didn't make up the concept ourselves.
Well, and I think the other interesting component is it's not new to the Railbelt. You know, we've been talking about this concept for decades. I was laughing because I was doing some research for our 85th anniversary for Matanuska Electric Association just the other day, and there was conversations being had about this and through the 60s, 70s, 80s. But also when you look at how the system used to operate, which is Chugach Electric was providing power to MEA, Homer, and Seward, they were doing this on the daily. You know, they were dispatching the system to benefit all of the members the most efficiently. So this has happened in the Railbelt. It's happening currently with the power pool between us and Chugach Electric right now. So we've taken steps, and there's a lot more opportunity out there as well.
So Julie, I'm going to steal Donovan's role just for a second. Like,
I was wondering how long that would take.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to talk about the fact that, in fact, much of the Railbelt was operated in a unified way by Chugach Electric not that long ago, right? Like, when did the tripartite agreement end and MEA started generating on their own as its own load balancing authority?
Yeah, so those decisions
to the central LBA.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. And at that time, ML&P was its own separate utility operating on its own as well. So it was Chugach Electric was doing this for Homer and MEA and Seward. So that decision was made by our members way back in like 2004. And Homer members as well. Homer left that agreement and started self-generating, I believe in 2013, but it may have been 2014. MEA was 2015. And so that did shift how we were, how the system was dispatched. Now, I'll add, though, that it also added some different opportunities. So when MEA came on to produce our own power, we now had these 10 smaller reciprocating engines that were a new resource to the Railbelt that could provide power in a very different way than the rest of the generation suite, as far as small increments, adding small increments of pretty high efficiency power at a broad range of use. And so not only was the operations a little different, but the suite of generation assets that we could pull from also shifted dramatically. Then, you know, different generation on the Kenai operated in a different way. And so it shifted in a lot of ways over the last decade.
Which you'd have to expect, given that there are new constraints, right? I mean, it has to be the case that if you're providing power to your own members, then you're going to have generation assets to do that. Not all bad that you chose what you chose for the system as a whole, but could you talk a little bit about why it is, your understanding of why it is that MEA, which you can speak to directly perhaps, and Homer chose to leave the arrangement where Chugach was effectively the generation and transmission utility for those, for you guys?
Yeah, that was well before even my time working at ASAP. You know, that was back in the early aughts.
Yep.
Just actually as I was entering Alaska as a dog measure. So I cannot speak to all of the complexities, although I know that the complexities are long and deep here in the Railbelt between the utilities. What I can say is I think both memberships felt as though they were not getting a fair shake and felt like they would get a better deal if they were producing their own power. Also at that time for MEA, there was new assets being built by Chugach Electric for SPP, much more efficient generation than the Beluga power plant, which had been holding a third of the Railbelt load pretty much for decades. So there were new assets being built on the Railbelt system. And at that point, anyways, when MEA made the final decision back in like 2012, before my time, that new generation was not an option for our members. And so it was either have power produced at the Beluga power plant, which was incredibly reliable, but not as efficient as the new generation, or produce our own power at using a much more efficient generation suite. And at the time, the analysis showed that we would actually be saving 30% of the fuel by producing it in a new generator that better matched our load profile. That's another component of this. MEA has a primarily residential load. So we peak in the morning and then everybody goes to Anchorage and then they come home. And so having a generator that could kind of match as our load quickly fell and then quickly came up in a more efficient manner than some of the other suite of generation on the Railbelt was also a huge asset. So that analysis is how we move forward with creating, in the end, our power plant. And again, all before my time, so there may be missing pieces in there, but generally, they thought that it was going to be cheaper power and more local control, which was important to the membership at the time.
Yeah, I will say I do not know all of the details of the Railbelt's history. I first came to Alaska in 2000 to work at the RCA as an economist there. And back then, friction over how the wholesale agreements between Chugach and MEA and Chugach and Homer Electric worked were longstanding and not infrequently came before the commission. And those so where you have one utility, which is, I mean, the story you're telling about, well, we're gonna build new assets and we get first crack at the power at it, right? And you get whatever's left over that's concerning, especially if you don't, under the agreement, have the option to build your own power, right? Like you had to, I mean, your own generation. So you had to leave the agreement to generate for yourself, basically, and benefit. So I think it's not a small thing to think about and be aware of as we start trying to imagine what it would be like to step into the Railbelt as a more unified whole in terms of how it's operated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we are 4 plus Seward, but 4 cooperatives who are, we are owned and run by our members. Our members elect our boards and the boards have the fiduciary responsibility. And I mean, it's not just financial, it's also that responsibility to make sure that we are solvent and providing power in for the decades to come, right? So there's a very important long-term commitment to our members, to our communities, to do right by them. And sometimes there's also a lot of benefit to those same members when we collaborate with others. And I think that's where it gets sticky, is defining that benefit and who and how that benefit is distributed among the different parties. So I think, it's been clear and in fact, I think that's really where a lot of the power pool started coming together. Was it because of the new suite of generation, it was now all of a sudden very economic for all the parties involved to join forces as to start sharing generation. And those initial conversations about the power pool, not as it ended up happening, was really driven by those economics, because there were shared benefits. And again, as individual cooperatives coming to the table to represent our members, I think there's some inherent conflicts with how we make this happen and just the realities. But I think the benefits are undeniable. So we've got to figure out how to sort it out. But they're tricky conversations that I don't think should be considered insignificant.
And maybe I'll steal my role back from you real quick and maybe make a point in the way of asking a question. I really appreciate, Julie, you grounding us in the cooperative model and the fact that each individually these utilities are trying to serve their members, but then also there's like 7 or 9 different principles of a cooperative, right? And I think one of those is cooperation with other cooperatives. So I think that's sort of what we're angling towards here, is a conversation around how we can get to that point where, to your point, there's value to be captured, perhaps not evenly divided between the utilities, but there's something that's something I was hoping to maybe touch on towards the end of this conversation, is just sort of like the components of the value to be captured, and maybe just bringing us back. So we've had something much closer to it before. It's also been a longer running conversation in the Railbelt about the benefits and like the need to sort of strive towards security constrained unified economic dispatch system wide. And then we took a step back for, to your point, really like strong, seemingly economic reasons for doing so. But now we've got this different sort of generation suite. And so across the Railbelt, it would look different from how it did before. Is that at least sort of like a somewhat faithful summary of just the point?
I think that's a very, it's hard to summarize those decades, but yes, I think that's a fair summary.
So then and the reason I was asking about models elsewhere is I know in preparing for this, us three were talking, and we sort of laid out that there's a few different models for this concept of unified economic dispatch. So and I could maybe list them off too if that's helpful to the conversation, but we sort of broke them out into 3 high level ones that would just be good for illustrating like what it could look like, and then perhaps sort of drilling towards one that would make sense for the Railbelt moving forward. So if would it be helpful if I just lay those out, or Anthony or Julie, did you want to sort of flesh those out yourself?
Well, I mean, before I mentioned like independent system operators, right? Or regional transmission operators. And typically in America, they manage a market. And what happens is people bid, they're bilateral contracts, of course, between generators and then the providers of power to distributed customers. But there is a market that people bid into, and an essential role of the independent system operator is to take bids from that market and then accept the bids with security constraints in a way that will provide power most cheaply. The thing is, mostly in those markets, you have a market clearing price on the margin. Now I'm simplifying a lot, because we get nodal prices and locational marginal prices and blah, blah, blah. But in general, the way that these markets work is that when there are bids into the market, the system operator takes the lowest bid that will clear the market, and then parties receive that price. So you have one market clearing price. Just when you go to the grocery store, there may be multiple growers that can provide apples, but there's one price of apples in the market. The grocer doesn't say, well, I got a really good deal from Jones, and so on this type of apple, you get Jones's price at cost plus. But then Fred gave me that was the market clearing price that I needed to get enough apples to supply to you, and it's a different price, right? So that kind of a system isn't going to work here, in my view. One of the first things I did when I was staff economist at the commission was evaluate whether I thought, because the legislature asked us to do that, but does the commission think that we could have just a competitive market for wholesale generation in the Railbelt? And my analysis at the time was no. Whoever has the cheapest gas supply owns the market, and it's pretty straightforward. And if they're bidding, then they've got an ability to basically determine the market, right? They have market power. So I think most people who have looked at it even a little bit kind of think, yeah, we probably don't want to have a so-called competitive market in the rail belt, because customers will be made worse off. There will be monopoly pricing of the power as opposed to cost pricing of the power. And that will make us worse off as customers. So that's one model. The other, I mean, the old tripartite agreement was another model, which is like MEA, as an example, bought all of their power from Chugach Electric under the terms of that contract. You had unified dispatch, but not necessarily fair distribution of the value of the power being generated. And disagreements about whether the split was fair or not helped undo that agreement. I mean, it wasn't renewed. And part of the thing that I heard from you too, Julie, though, was because MEA didn't have rights under that contract to build and self-provide if it made sense for them, then it was necessary to simply exit the market. Whereas in the independent system operator markets, you have competitive entry of generation. Anybody can do that. Anybody can try to enter the market if they think they can profitably participate.
Yeah, and I do not know the specific terms of that very initial tripartite agreement with MEA and Chugach. But once we knew we needed to build, then we were going to build for all of our generation. So, but that final decision, the terms of the contract, we required to give them 10 years notice. So that's what happened way back in 2004, 2005-ish. And so then began this 10 years of, okay, now what? And as we got to the end of the 10 years, that's when I actually started working for MEA. And there was correspondence, I think, at that point between Chugach and MEA, as MEA was trying to sort out what is our play here. That is where it was, okay, now we have this new generation suite being built. We're not interested in adding another engine onto that for you guys, MEA, but you can have this power over here. And that's where the economics just of building our own actually made much more sense than from Beluga. So, it wasn't exactly in that nice, tidy order. I think that because decisions were made 10 years prior, that then there was the long lead time, the planning, and then the execution of our own power plant. But I think your point is still a fair one, in that, there was, it was a wholesale all requirements contract. So.
Yeah.
And
then,
then,
Homer is a little bit different, but Homer did have some of their own generation, and Chugach had rights to supply everything that Homer didn't supply. Anyway, it was a little bit different arrangement, and I forget the details now because I forget everything. But yeah, the stickiness in contracts can be a problem, right? Where people start, because I mean, on the whole, it should have been the case that it was more efficient to still have unified economic dispatch, but under different institutional arrangements, right? Like, it has to be the case that if you're operating all of your assets to meet all of your demand in a unified way, you have fewer constraints, you can do some more efficiently. That is, as Julie said, at less cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as the wholesale cost of that power is something that most closely matches the actual costs of running that generation. And I think that's where there seemed to be some issue, is that the feeling that wholesale cost of power had other items in there that maybe MEA didn't need to pay for, and we could do it cheaper without those items in the wholesale cost. So part of it is how power is priced. And if you're using your own generation, that's just cost. And it's it's right through to the members directly, no markups.
One of the things, going back to the definition, Donovan, that I want to kind of stress about this is that while there was unified economic dispatch before, assuming, of course, that Chugach was behaving in a reasonable way. Sorry for the alarms there. The pricing of the power included the cost, the all-in costs of generation and some transmission assets, which is a very different arrangement from the power pooling that is currently happening under a wholesale contract today between MEA and Chugach Electric, where the costs of generating that power, I mean, they're doing unified economic dispatch between them, but the pricing does not include any consideration from the embedded or capital costs of that power, which is a great thing. And so it helps ensure that, well, of the assets that they have today, there is a straightforward way of running stuff and then dividing the benefits between the parties. There's still some argument about the right, what is the right way to divide the benefits, but if benefits are calculated by the difference between what it would cost to generate as a single load balancing area, which is what they're doing now, versus two fully separate load balancing areas, the savings there are relatively straightforward to determine. There are a lot of complications, but it's comparatively straightforward. And then you can just split them according to a sharing rule.
So, and then I think, just not knowing as much as you both do about this concept, it becomes a bit more complicated once you add additional parties to those sorts of negotiations and contracts. Is that right?
Yeah, it does. I am incredibly fortunate that when I was at ML&P, I got to spend most of my time negotiating for ML&P with Chugach Electric and MEA in trying to put together a tight power pool for the central region. So this was before Chugach bought ML&P. And so there were three parties there. And I have to say, it was incredibly refreshing, good negotiations, in part because there were no lawyers in the room. And it was engineers and me. And we met twice a week for a couple of hours at a shot, I think. in a stinky little room on Electron Drive. I got to play for a year and a half. And then they continued after I left. And then eventually the acquisition happened, and then those efforts were tabled.
Mhm. But at least,
But we were able to make progress, but I would say with 3 parties, it is so much more difficult than with 2.
mhm,
One of the complications that we faced, and it was very significant, is suppose you have a circumstance in which you have 1 seller and 2 buyers. So Chugach Electric has got, for example, the most efficient generator that can provide power that both MEA and ML&P want to buy. Imagine that. If you have 1 seller and 2 buyers, who gets how much of that cheap power? And how should it best be priced, given that the 2 buyers have different opportunities?
mhm.
So working through that was incredibly difficult and tentative. And certainly as we think about trying to expand such an arrangement to the Railbelt as a whole, you have that over and over again, right? You might have 2 buyers and 2 sellers. You might have 1 seller and 3 buyers. You might, all of those sorts of things create very complicated issues. And if everybody wants to do, and the co-ops have this duty as well as cooperative duty, they have a duty to do best by their members, their own members. So they always properly are trying to get the very best deal for their own members. Well, with more than 1 party, it makes it hard.
Mhm.
Well,
maybe-
and I think it's interesting to think about it as buyers, because in the power pool, it really isn't buying. We're really just dispatching as 1 system. Now there are opportunities to then sell. The pool can sell as economy energy sales through tariffs that we have to other parties. But I think to your point, Anthony, is that when there's 3 people in the pool, how do you make sure when you're talking about the benefits of a transaction, how do you make sure that there's equal benefit, whether that's in efficiency, cost, whatever, reliability? How do you make sure those benefits are shared in a way that's fair?
Well, and let me just say, Julie, like when I use the phrase buyers, you use the phrase settlement, and we mean the same thing.
Right.
So
Well, I think that's just important, but there is a nuance there. But yes, you're right. User.
Well, from my perspective, it is a sale, right? So Chugach is operating their stuff in the event that MEA is generating less because of the pool than it otherwise would on its own. Chugach is generating more, and MEA is operating less. Effectively, Chugach generators are supplying electrons, kilowatt hours, to MEA customers, right? And
vice versa.
And vice versa, absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
But from my perspective, that's like a transaction, right? Under that contract, you have rights to those electrons, right? Or those kilowatt hours, you have rights, but then you also have obligations to pay at a proper settlement price. But you're right. I mean, it's like you don't determine a price for the power. You determine a total amount of savings, and then you split it.
Correct.
So, but in effect, there's a price.
It's not an economy energy agreement, right? It's
Correct.
not that they're offering to give us this amount. It's we as a team are dispatching, and then things we've said settlement a couple times here. But that's really where you true up to both members, both sets of members, for how those benefits get distributed, and the power pool that we're currently in with Chugach Electric, that's contractually a sharing of the benefits.
And so maybe I'll jump back in too. So we've spoken about 2 of at least like the 3 models that we spoke about before this. And I do want to get to, I mean, I think my entree into this discussion around like what is the juice worth a squeeze? I mean, obviously, if this is something spoken about for decades, and something that, you know, I think, you know, Julie, you can hopefully share just like high level feedback about the value that you've seen from, you know, that tight power pool agreement with Chugach, and then, you know, we can talk about just, you know, the benefits that we could see Railbelt wide coming from all of this. I think that's what we want to drive towards is, you know, is this something worth pursuing? Despite all of these complications that you guys have really started to help lay out, which I think is really important, obviously for context too, like why haven't we gotten there yet? This complex thing, but maybe just to point to one of the other models. So we've talked about the market approach, and then these sort of like pre-wired agreements and settlements between the parties. And then we also spoke before about just a single operator, sort of like an independent entity who has control over the system and then can sort of flip the switches in order to get to this security constrained unified economic dispatch. Did you want to touch on that at all, either of you, before we
Well,
sort
there's
of
the last one, right? And the last one, I mean, you can have a market, you can pre-wire contracts, right?
Mhm.
Or you could have a single rail belt G&T,
Mhm.
right? A generation and transmission company, which people have talked about a lot from time to time, and it waxes and wanes. The last sort of bigger effort that I am aware of was back in 2008, I think. There was an effort called the Greater Rail Belt Gretzey, Greater Rail Belt Transmission and Electricity Company or something like that. And it was a pitch to get the legislature to spend a whole bunch of money, sort of buy out the utilities, create this G&T, which would then be run by the utilities. I think the idea of a G&T is great, right? Like, let's just have one utility. It would be so much simpler. And there should be savings, and you could have unified dispatch. It would be cool. But I personally am skeptical about how we get there, given that we're no longer rolling in petrodollars. Do you want to add anything to that? I mean, do you have a more hopeful view of a rail belt G&T, Julie?
Well, I think there's different models. I mean, I think the G&T concept where all the generation and transmission assets are being, I mean, you could do an ownership, right? But there's other models where those units are just pledged to this generation and transmission group. I mean, I think there's a lot of benefits there beyond just economic dispatch. I mean, just even the ability to make joint decisions on transmission and generation paths forward, especially during this time of uncertainty, is really appealing. You know, there's been models, say in Iceland, we took a policy tour there a few years ago. They made this happen. They had, you know, a few similar, very, very similar size system, very, very similar issues. And they, as a state, came together and started just by having these different individual utilities pledged assets that then could be managed. I mean, there's decision-making efficiencies that you can gain there. There are operational, and then even from like a maintenance. So I think the concept's interesting. I think to your point, Anthony, I think it's really complicated. Even as, you know, when you think about ownership, even the current statute and bylaws that govern utilities. I mean, I know for MEA, if we want to divest ourselves of any more than 15, I think, % of our assets, we have to have a super majority of our members, or a majority of our members vote, and a super majority of those members vote yes. And, you know, we were very proud this year to have 14% of our members vote for, which is a high, you know, a 10-year high in our annual election. So actually, you know, just even practically making it all happen. But are there other models where we could still retain our assets and coordinate in a more effective way? Probably. But I think the devil's always in the details of those, and I think more work needs to be done to understand.
Maybe to that point, just because you've got 16 minutes left, I do want to leave at least 10 minutes for addressing some of the questions we've gotten from our audience. And you really laid out nicely, Julie, that there are a lot of spam calls happening these days. I don't know if you guys heard the chime, so apologies for that. But I did want to spend just a bit of time fleshing out, maybe not like dollar values, because some of these are not financial, but just sort of at a high level, like why the juice is worth the squeeze, right? Like what benefits could we see from adopting one of these models for the rail belt to get all of the cooperatives working together to, you know, to adhere to security constrained unified economic dispatch for the rail belt. So we've really, I think, messaged around and spoken a bit about the financial savings that come from a more efficiently operated grid, but you really laid out a number of other ones, Julie, and I know, Anthony, you've really sort of done a great job of expressing in prior conversations this the magnitude of value that comes from flexibly deploying the system. So could we just flesh out perhaps like the values that would come from getting to this model that would then justify all of the sort of hard work of identifying a model and fleshing out, you know, answering all of those tough questions that we've delineated today?
Yeah, you know, I think we've kind of bounced around talking about a couple different efforts. And so it may be confusing to the folks watching at home that, you know, we talked about there was a power pool effort. I mean, there's been power pool efforts through the decades, as I mentioned, but then there was one around Chugach, MLMP, and MEA that then evolved. And when there was the sale of MLMP to Chugach Electric, one of the stipulations that the RCA put on is that MEA and Chugach would now enter into a tight power pool. So this is happening right now. We've alluded to it, but since 2021, MEA and Chugach have been in partnership on this tight power pool. It's contractual obligations to each other and overseen by the RCA. And just in those 4 years, we've seen $23.2 million in combined savings between the two organizations. So that's significant and still rolling. And the way that our contract works is we split those benefits. So it's just over $11.5 million to each utility over those years. And from a fuel savings, it's been about 2.2 BCF in fuel savings. So significant. And I think we think worth the squeeze. Those savings are real, especially as prices are increasing. You know, before we got into this power pool, there was some studies done initially by a transmission organization that was trying to understand, okay, if there was more transmission, what would the benefits be? And they did a study about the benefits of economic dispatch. And at that time, again, this was about a decade ago, they found that of all the benefits and you know, some of this is covered under non-disclosure agreements, so I can't go into a lot of the details, but about 75% of the value was to be found in some sort of power pool or economic dispatch situation between MLMP, Chugach, and MEA. And so that is actually effectively happening. You just heard these numbers. This is what we're actually finding. So I know there's been these other, you know, numbers thrown out through the years and other studies, but 23.2 million over that 4-year span between both organizations is what we're actually finding. That study also thought about 20% more could be gained benefit by including Golden Valley. And then it was a smaller negligible amount to include Homer/Seward into that, like about the rest of the 5%. So we are getting a lot of the juice right now, and those savings are real and I think worth all the complications. And I think, you know, it would be interesting to do that study again with the current fuel prices, with the current projections of fuel prices, both diesel and gas, reaching Alaska in the upcoming years. So like I said, I think there's more studies that need to be done just to really understand what's possible. But I think as the complexity increases, it makes more and more sense to join efforts to try to solve those complexities, share risk. You know, I think that's another huge benefit for collaboration is you're sharing risk, you're sharing, you know, balance sheets. There's different, you know, currently different financial capabilities for the different co-ops and, you know, how could those be brought together again in a way that's fair to each of the members. But I think we're all in different situations. We all have different access to different resources depending on our placement on the system as well. And so being able to leverage that diversity is pretty powerful, both from risk mitigation and and financial, but also, you know, just looking at from a diversifying the portfolio, which each of the utilities have indicated as a goal. So I'll stop talking now, let Anthony add.
No, I think, Julie, one of the things that I violently agree with you about is that assessment of the benefits of doing this will continue to change as prices change, as resources change, and as constraints change. One of the things that I've run up against an awful lot as an economist working in Alaska over the years is there's a blind, often a very naive faith that you can model what benefits from doing something like this will be. And models are useful for helping ask better questions. They're really bad for doing long-term predictions, because the most important things we can't really do a very good job predicting. And so I did this kind of modeling when I was consulting for the commission in 2015, you know, and drove very different numbers for the benefits of economic dispatch, depending upon what you assumed for the trajectory of different fuels in different locations on the rail belt. But I think one of the things we know is once you make the transition, the benefits will be positive. You don't necessarily know how big they will be, but they have to be positive. Assuming you design, you put together a well-designed system. So again, from my perspective, especially in a time of real uncertainty and transition, we are better off having a more flexible system than a less flexible system. You know, E3, Julie's going to probably hit me through the screen, but E3 did a study which was directed by the Railbelt utilities, looking at the ability to integrate some large wind projects on the Railbelt. And as part of that study, they try to calibrate their model under existing conditions in 2022. And they came up with an assessment that, you know, we might be able to save more than $40 million a year if we actually had unified economic dispatch. And part of that is, again, you dispatch the system automatically. You don't try to have people figure out what their transactions should be on a moment by moment basis. So it just all happens. The operators operate most efficiently, and then we sort out the details later around who should get what of the savings. Yeah, we are looking in future at significantly higher prices, almost certainly. And this is not going to prevent that. Unified economic dispatch will not prevent it, but it will blunt to some extent, maybe more and maybe less, the impact of those costs on consumers. Well, I mean, one of the reasons why REAP is interested, you know, is of course, it would be easier to integrate large scale renewable energy on the system if we were dispatching it in a more unified way. There are also complications with that, but so anyway. But like we as a rail belt missed some opportunities probably by not having this system in place a number of years ago, because if we had, we might have been able to take advantage of some federally subsidized wind power, which would have been good for all of our members going forward. We didn't, and so too bad, but who knows what the opportunities will be going forward.
The road of Alaska is paved with all the what ifs, I think. So, but I think that makes the point, like, let's not be another one, and let's figure out how to do the hard things. and make sure that, you know, we're respectful of all of the different member needs and realities, technical realities, constraints on the current system. You know, I think there's a lot that we do need to respect. This isn't just, oh, this is easy, it's being done everywhere, let's snap our fingers. But I do think that it's probably worth the squeeze to take a harder look at.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I was hoping folks could take home, and then maybe we'll plant the seed for the continued conversation around this, just in terms of like what is the path towards actually getting there. But it is worth the squeeze. I think we can all agree, right? Like the Railbelt utility, and an understanding that I have that you should push back on if it's inaccurate is that we all stand to benefit. But you know, right now the cooperatives are working independently to try and, you know, serve their members, and so there's just a perception of they want to, like, if there are savings to be gained or to be captured, that they want to maximize the savings that come to their members. And so it's a matter of sort of not will we benefit, it's just how much will each of us benefit from adopting this, because as you've laid out, there are several different benefits to be attained, and and at the same time it will be a hard path to walk. And so I think we're in agreement that it's one worth walking, and it's just sort of, to your point, devils are in the details, and we want to work together and assemble a broad coalition of folks who can answer those hard questions and then reach some sort of like end state that's, you know, beneficial and also agreed to. And I think that sort of lays us out. I've been tracking a number of the questions from the chat here. You did a really good job, Julie, of addressing the one from Jay Hermanson about just sort of like initial you know, feedback from the tight power pool agreement and the savings that you guys are seeing so far. Meg Waite had a number of really great questions, some of which are related to things that REAP is already sort of, you know, either considering or working on. So maybe just to, in the interest of time, try and simplify the question and answer it at the same time. Her part A question really relates to just, you know, building energy efficiency codes and whether that's something that folks in the Railbelt are discussing. I'll just, you know, say on behalf of REAP that the policy team here and our public policy committee itself has been discussing just the potential for, you know, advocating for a statewide energy efficiency standard. So that's certainly, you know, with the session ending yesterday, not something that we'll be doing, you know, yesterday, but something that we'll be talking about throughout the summer. And of course, you know, through our public policy committee process, having that conversation with REAP members and other stakeholders like MEA and all those affected, you know, building owners and ratepayers and all that sort of thing. Part B was really, I can just read it because it's shorter, but more broadly, how are stakeholders thinking about energy planning in a way that includes not only utility members, but renters and low-income households, non-member utility customers, other communities impacted by long-term energy system decisions. I mean, I've got the experts right here. The RRC's IRP processes is sort of that avenue at the moment. That itself is a really important and also like deep conversation to be had. Certainly something that REAP wants to be co-hosting events with, you know, the utilities and the RRC and other stakeholder groups represented on that body. So just to say perhaps that the Railbelt Reliability Council is in the process of developing an integrated resource plan for the Railbelt region. And as you know, as an organization that's involved in that, REAP really wants to raise awareness and share with folks opportunities for getting involved. So we've shared resources in the past, but we're sort of at a point where we should share updates with folks about what's going on in the different working groups. And certainly as there's opportunities for the public to sort of review the work product and then, you know, voice their considerations and priorities in relation to a few different project portfolios, we'll be raising awareness and sort of hoping to plug folks in. So maybe that's just a placeholder for a concept and a discussion to be had in another venue at a different time real soon.
Yeah, and I think to Meg's point, I mean, that is where there's, you know, the utilities are represented on there. There's environmental consumers, there's small consumers, large consumers, independent. So that really is a place where, and there is a very public and transparent process for all of it. And input is encouraged and necessary really for the work that we're doing. So that is a great way to have multiple voices at that planning table that hasn't existed in the past in the same way. So it's pretty cool.
And then Meg,
and also very complicated.
Yeah, yeah,
and hard.
So it's our job to try and distill that down for, especially for folks who are very knowledgeable about these issues, but also have a lot else going on, to distill it down to actionable information. So we'll be working to do so. And then Meg had another great question that I think helps us to just sort of like summarize and wrap up here. Just calling attention to the fact that it's a very technical and informative webinar. And also it's always really important to that point that you just made, Julie, that these sort of highly specialized conversations are made more accessible and like publicly understood. And so that was sort of the motivation for today's webinar. And of course, we're not going to solve the issue of, what model for unified economic dispatch fits the Railbelt and how we get there during a 1 hour sort of lunch conversation. But really just to try and summarize at least the points that came out to me and that I hope stick with the audience are just that, it's a model for just flexibly and efficiently deploying generation and transmission assets on our grid across the separate cooperatives in a way that can, keep energy costs low and stable, and then also reap, other sorts of benefits, whether it's system-wide flexibility and its relation to other things like planning for the future of the system. It's a model that's been, or there are several different models which have been, enacted elsewhere in the United States. And so while those are not, mappable onto the Railbelt, at least we know that there are paths for getting there. And also it's something that's been spoken about for decades here in the Railbelt. But to Julie and Anthony's points, like because there are different models and because, this system is constantly evolving, certain like snapshots in time, whether it's valuing the benefits to be gleaned or the approach moving forward, are perhaps not so relevant for this time and place. But I think what we've sort of landed on in agreement at the end of this webinar is just that the juice is worth the squeeze. There's a lot of benefits to be seen from adhering to, security constrained unified economic dispatch here in the Railbelt, and the hard work is assembling the necessary parties to really flesh out what that looks like, what agreements need to be in place in order for the interested parties to feel comfortable with it and to agree to it. And so that's sort of the seed that I wanted to plant about continuing conversations and perhaps a fall energy speaker series webinar on the topic. But I want to let Anthony and Julie have the final word. So if I misspoke in any way, please let me know, or just any other lessons or points that you wanted to leave our audience with before we close for the afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about the complexity of all of this, and I think we decided that the juice is worth the squeeze, but I think there's still some folks that are questioning that. And I think that there's more conversations to have. And I think that concept of fairness balanced with a regional approach, we're going to have to walk through that in a really intentional way in order to get to that next step. Again, we'll talk about that later, but I didn't want to lift off here with everybody thinking like everybody loves economic dispatch, because there are folks that question the value, and if it does, say, erode their current members' value. So I think those are all important conversations, because we're not going to get through it without being able to answer those. So looking forward to another discussion on the topic with this team. Thanks, Donovan.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, great job. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And we did go a few minutes over, so I just wanted to really sort of share my gratitude with the audience who was here throughout, and also, the great group who's stuck with us a few minutes extra. This is the final installment in our 2026 Spring Energy Speaker Series, so really grateful to Siri for sponsoring the series and helping us bring these conversations to a wide-ranging audience across Alaska and across topics, really. We covered things like unified economic dispatch, obviously, today, but the nexus of food and energy in Alaska, the clean energy workforce opportunities and sort of bottlenecks to be addressed, and even just the topic of gas supply and its implications for heating, and for folks to be affected in the short, medium, and long term, and solutions for trying to address those cost considerations. So just really appreciative to the audience today, to our series sponsor, to our esteemed panelists. We'll be sharing this out afterwards and hope to continue the conversation with you all. But on that note, I want to let you all get back to your Thursday afternoons and just really appreciate today's conversation. Thanks, everybody.